Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Toronto Suburban Railway. This was a railway operator that operated multiple interurban lines and a local streetcar network within the village of West Toronto. I did briefly go over this company in my videos on the Rogers Road and Davenport streetcars, but this one will be a bit more in depth. So, let's get into the video. The origins of the Toronto Suburban Railway begin in the late 1800s in the village of West Toronto Junction. The village had been incorporated in 1888, by which point it was already home to 900 residents. Its rapid growth can be attributed to the fact that the village sat in the area we today call the Junction. This name derives from the large railway junction located in the area connecting the Canadian Pacific's Credit Valley and Toronto Grey and Bruce lines, as well as the Grand Trunk Railway. Industrial and residential developments would spring up in the area attracted by the railway's presence. Eventually, village leaders would decide that the village could benefit from a streetcar service. This would not only serve the 900 residents in the village and connect them to the city, but it would also set up the village for future growth. As the city of Toronto to the south continued to expand, it was only inevitable that the village of West Toronto Junction would begin to see spillover from the city. On November 12, 1890, the village alongside the townships of York and Etobicoke would grant an operating charter to the newly established Weston, High Park and Toronto Street Railway Company to construct a horse-drawn streetcar line within the village. This line was to be built to a gauge of 4 feet 10 3/4 inches. A year later, in 1891, the company would change its name to the City and Suburban Electric Railway, as it intended to take advantage of the new electric trolleys instead of using horse-drawn cars. Cars would now be powered by 550 volts DC power. On April 20th, 1891, the village would grant a 30-year operating charter to the newly formed Davenport Street Railway to operate a line built to the same streetcar gauge, connecting the village to the Toronto Railway Company's Bathurst streetcar, thus creating a transit link between the village and the city of Toronto. After a year of construction, on September 6, 1892, the DSR would begin service on its lone streetcar route. This route would run from the center of the village at the intersection of Keele and Dundas Streets. It would run north to St. Clair Avenue, east to Ford Street, south to Davenport Road, west to Bathurst Street, and south to the CP rail tracks where passengers could transfer to the Bathurst streetcar. A single passing loop would be constructed at Lansdowne Avenue. Beyond serving West Toronto Junction, it would also serve the communities of Carleton, Davenport, and Brackendale. Service on the route was every 30 minutes and cars would operate on a single track line. Service at first, however, had to be split at the Grand Trunk Railway tracks as no level crossing diamond had been constructed by the time of opening, so passengers were required to transfer between cars at the tracks. This would be fixed 10 days later on September 16th when a new level crossing was installed, allowing streetcars to cross the railway tracks. In the meantime, the City and Suburban was busy constructing its streetcar line within the village proper. In October of 1892, the C&SER would begin operations on its own streetcar route. This route doesn't appear to have a name and operated along Dundas Street between Humberside Avenue and Gilmore Avenue. In April of 1893, this route would be given the name Crescent and extended south on Gilmore Avenue, east on Louisa Street, today's St. John's Road, and south on Fairview Avenue to Evelyn Crescent. Cars would operate on a single track and run every half hour. In 1894, the Toronto Railway Company would extend its Dundas streetcar to Humberside Avenue, connecting with the City and Suburban's Crescent streetcar. The routes would be connected, and this connection would be used for special car movements, although through service was never operated. This connection to the Dundas streetcar would prove to be far more convenient for riders heading into and out of Toronto compared to the old connection via the Davenport streetcar to Bathurst Street. As such, the Crescent streetcar would quickly become the main route within the village, while the Davenport streetcar would assume a secondary role, primarily serving as a local route for the communities along it. While the two routes connected to each other at the intersection of Keele and Dundas, there was never any real competition between the two. In fact, there had been a growing idea to merge the two services together. In February of 1894, the owners of the DSR and C&SER would request and receive an Act of Parliament allowing for the establishment of the Toronto Suburban Railway. Cars for the TSR would be stored in a new car house constructed on the south side of St. Clair Avenue just west of Old Weston Road. That same year, the TSR would establish its first interurban line, that being the Weston Interurban. This would be a 6.3 kilometer line running from the intersection of Keele and Dundas into the village of Weston. Specifically, the route would run north on Keele Street to St. Clair Avenue. It would then cut across to the west side of Weston Road and continue north. South of the village limits, the route would cut back onto the center of Weston Road and continue to its terminus at King Street. Passing loops would be constructed at Seneca Avenue, Buttonwood Avenue, and King Street. Additional stops were probably located at St. Clair Avenue, McCormick Avenue, Seneca Avenue, Lambton Avenue, Mount Dennis, Buttonwood Avenue, Denison Road, and Lawrence Avenue. I say probably as I couldn't find exactly what was happening here and I am working off of old maps to find the most likely locations. The Weston line would operate every 20 minutes. A single fare for the line was 5 cents, half for children, and 10 cents if riding a night car. A grim episode would take place on the Weston Interurban as James Salmon would state in his book Rails from the Junction, the story of the Toronto Suburban Railway. Car 20 gained notoriety for having roasted a little girl's pet cat in one of its unprotected rheostats under the longitudinal seats. The cat apparently became wedged in somehow, and it wasn't until the odor of frying cat became quite noticeable that motorman Bert Thompson found and extricated the corpse, while the passengers abandoned the car in search of fresh air. At some point after the route's opening, it would be extended 300 meters north to the Weston Post Office at Church Street. 2 years later, in 1896, the TSR would open its third streetcar line, that being the Lambton streetcar. This route would operate from Humberside Avenue west along Dundas Street to a turnback loop at Lambton Park. This loop would feature a small waiting area and refreshment stand. Cars would operate every 15 minutes on this route. The construction of this route wasn't just to serve the residents of the western side of the village, it was also built to serve the company-owned Lambton Park. This park was a popular picnic area and generated seasonal traffic to an otherwise sparsely populated area. By the late 1890s, ownership of the TSR had consolidated around the Royce family, with ownership specifically falling to Alan H. Royce. While the TSR's expansion had been rapid, it was not all smooth sailing. The company had been consistently caught up in arguments with municipal officials over franchise agreements, conditions of its roadbeds, and poor service. One of these arguments would involve the company's refusal to extend the Weston Interurban to the village's northern limit. In 1898, then general manager of the TSR, W.B. Close, would draw the ire of the village when he called it one of those villages a few yards wide and 2 miles long. 10 years later, an irate mayor for the town of West Toronto would vow to never extend the company's franchise one day past its expiry date. He would never get this chance though, as the town of West Toronto would be annexed by the city of Toronto in 1909. By that point, the town had swelled to a population of 12,500 residents. In 1899, the Toronto Railway Company would purchase operating rights along Dundas Street between Humberside Avenue and Keele Street. With this, the TRC would extend its Dundas streetcar to Keele Street to better connect to the TSR's services. The Crescent and Lambton streetcars would see their routes cut back to Keele Street as part of this. In 1901 and 1904, the provincial government would pass legislation allowing for the TSR to expand its service into Hamilton, Brampton, Guelph, Woodbridge, and the Niagara Peninsula. The Etobicoke Township would grant the TSR a franchise allowing for the construction of tracks along Dundas Street within Etobicoke as part of a possible extension to Hamilton. In 1902, the TSR would begin grading and laying tracks along Dundas Street between Lambton Mills and Somerville, but work soon stopped. Why work stopped on this extension is unknown. It may be that the Royce family had been frightened off by a rival Toronto to Hamilton project, or perhaps they simply didn't have the money for such a massive expansion. In 1907, the TSR would examine the possibility of a new streetcar line connecting West Toronto with the village of Swansea and the Mimico interurban. The proposal was for the route to run south on Keele Street from Dundas, west on Annette Street, and then south on Runnymede Road and Ellis Avenue to Lakeshore. West Toronto's Town Council did not want streetcars running on Annette Street, so the TSR would revise the proposal. Instead, it would now be a southern extension of the Crescent streetcar, with cars continuing south on Evelyn Crescent, Kennedy Avenue, and Ellis Avenue to Lakeshore. Ultimately though, for whatever reason, this extension was never built. Money had always been a bit of an issue for the company, as while it was turning a modest profit, the services had always been operated on a proverbial shoestring budget. The Crescent and Davenport streetcars consistently lost money, while the Lambton and Weston routes were marginal operations. James Salmon gives a great recount of what the TSR was like. For the Davenport streetcar, he states, "During a storm or shower, the grab bars became charged very highly, giving some of the riders a severe jolt. Trackage was in a wretched condition in later years, and poor rail bonding was a consistent nuisance. Crews often had to use copper or switch irons to get the cars underway." Of the Crescent streetcar, he would state, "A ride on the Crescent streetcar was unusually noisy, owing to the sandy streets in the Fairview district. There was no passing siding on the line, and a single car was scheduled to follow the Lambton car outbound while preceding it inbound." Finally, for the Lambton streetcar, he would state, "The cars were mainly single truckers that bounced along with the front and rear vestibules performing a violent teeter-totter movement." In 1907, the TSR would turn a profit of $8,407. This would grow to $14,631 in 1910. The company was, however, in need of new capital, managerial expertise, and revenue-generating extensions. All of this would come in 1911 when the TSR was purchased by Sir William Mackenzie. Unlike his other purchases, the TSR would not be folded into the Toronto and York Radial Railway, but would instead become a subsidiary of Mackenzie's Canadian Northern Railway. This purchase no doubt made the city of Toronto's animosity towards him even worse, as he was now in control of literally every streetcar and interurban in Toronto. His public transit monopoly was complete. Mackenzie, for his part, didn't seem fazed by this, as he was focused on executing his grand vision for the Toronto Suburban Railway. This vision included linking the TSR to his proposed Toronto Eastern Railway to Oshawa, bringing the cars into downtown Toronto either to Union Station or a new interurban terminal at Yonge and Cottingham Streets, and expanding the network outwards. In 1911, the TSR moved 1,235,000 passengers on its 4 routes. It seemed, at least on the surface, that Mackenzie had an unlimited amount of money to use on expanding the TSR. This, however, isn't true, and in fact things were about to turn sour for Mackenzie. In 1912, the TSR would begin construction on 2 new interurban lines, one to Woodbridge and one to Guelph. However, construction on these would be anything but smooth, as Canadian Railway and Marine World would state. Work was delayed considerably by the scarcity of labor, the difficulty in getting delivery of materials, and wet weather. This was bad news for Mackenzie, as every day of construction was a day without revenue. Even worse is by this point his Canadian Northern Railway was collapsing into bankruptcy. The new line to Guelph would prove to be particularly troublesome, so in the meantime the TSR would give priority to the Woodbridge route. Villager Mary Wood would state of the route's construction. Each crew consisted of 12 teams of horses, 1 man with each team and 3 laborers. Work progressed slowly using graders, scrapers, and diggers, etc., and much manual labor until freeze up in the winter. Temporary accommodations would be established along the way for men and horses. The rails and ties used for the route would be hauled in from the CP railway tracks at Wilson Avenue. The tracks would reach Woodbridge in 1913, but a last-minute dispute with the village council over where the terminal would be would delay the opening of the route for another year. Service to Woodbridge would finally commence on October 10, 1914. This was essentially an 18-kilometer extension of the Weston interurban from the village of Weston to the village of Woodbridge. The route would carry on down the middle of Weston Road from Church Street to the Grand Trunk Railway tracks. North of them, it would run along the west side of Weston Road on a 20-meter wide right-of-way to what is today Albion Road. The route would follow Albion Road to Elmhurst Drive, where it would cut through empty fields to Islington Avenue. It would then continue along the west side of Islington through Thistletown before turning west on Albion Road. The route would then turn north and run along the east side of Kipling Avenue before breaking off just south of Steeles and largely paralleling the Humber River to its terminus at Pine Street in Woodbridge. Additional stops were located at Chews Side Road, Chews Crossing, McMillan's Crossing, Frost's Crossing, Irwin's Road, Concession A, Thistletown, Albion Road Crossing, Torrance Road Crossing, Churchill's Crossing, Vaughan Town Line, Plankett's Gate, and Wallace's. A wooden station building would be constructed in Woodbridge and a passenger shelter and substation at Thistletown. Service on the route was once every hour from 7 a.m. to midnight. The route would use modern cars that could seat 48 passengers, and a single fare from Dundas Street to Woodbridge cost 10 cents. That's $2.74 today. The route would prove successful with residents from Woodbridge using it to commute into the junction to shop. Teenagers would ride the cars to get to Weston High School and Vocational School, which was apparently one of the best in Ontario in the 1910s and 20s. The TSR would run extra cars during Woodbridge Fair Day to accommodate the increased number of riders from Weston and Toronto. The TSR would also operate a small freight and express service on the route. Finally, passing loops would be installed at Thistletown and Albion Road to handle the increased traffic. The villages of Weston and Woodbridge would benefit from the interurban service. The village of Weston would see its population increase from 1,728 to 3,104 between 1911 and 1921. The village of Woodbridge would see a smaller increase from 557 to 661 residents. In January of 1917, the TSR would re-gauge its entire network to standard gauge. That same year, the TSR would begin construction on an eastern extension of the Davenport streetcar, with tracks being laid as far east as Huron Street. The extension was to see the route extended east along Davenport Road to Poplar Plains Road. From there, it would run on the Canadian Northern right-of-way to Yonge Street. This extension was intended to provide a connection to the Yonge streetcar, which offered a better connection into downtown Toronto. However, the City of Toronto, in its feud with Sir William Mackenzie, would block this extension, and ultimately the tracks that had been laid were pulled up before ever being put into service. While the Woodbridge Interurban was up and running and finding some success, the construction of the Guelph Interurban was still an ongoing ordeal. The construction of the Interurban to Guelph was the most complex and challenging interurban project in Toronto. Construction crews had to contend with the most rugged countryside and deepest river valleys of any interurban in Toronto. This was compounded by labor shortages in 1912 and 1913, which had turned into material shortages with the outbreak of World War I. Even worse was the growing financial issues faced by Sir William Mackenzie as his Canadian Northern Railway continued to fail. Finally, municipal governments had begun standing up to the extreme demands of the railways, and due to the growing use of cars, they began dragging their feet on letting the railways cross certain roads. The City of Toronto would delay its decision on letting the TSR run the Guelph line into the city, as it would use standard gauge tracks, and the city feared freight trains running on city streets. Prior to the startup of the line, a fire would destroy 2 of the 6 new cars the TSR had purchased to run the route. Ultimately, though, the Guelph Interurban would finally open on April 14, 1917, after 5 years of construction. Unlike the Weston and Woodbridge lines, the Guelph Interurban would be built with the most advanced construction of the time to allow for high-speed operations. The route would run on 60-pound steel rails and was powered by an overhead catenary supplying 1500 volts DC power. The cars used on the line would be equipped with a switch to change to the local 550 volts DC in West Toronto and Guelph. James Salmon would state of the line, saying it was one of the most spectacular interurban railways in Canada. The TSR would purchase 6 60-foot cars built by the Preston Car Company. 3 of the cars would be standard coach cars that could seat 69 passengers, however 2 were lost in the fire. The other 3 were combination cars that carried freight and passengers, seating 53. James Salmon would say that the cars were finished in the most modern manner of the times, with high back seats upholstered in green plush, low-level doors, and leaded prismatic glass in the upper sash. What is not stated in that quote is that the seats featured headrests and footrests. The car interiors themselves had luggage racks, polished brass handrails, and a cherry wood finish. It is safe to say that interurbans, at least in and around Toronto, peaked here. As for the route itself, it would run a 74-kilometer route starting from the intersection of Keele and Dundas, following the Lambton streetcar to Lambton Park. The route would cut through the park and parallel the CP railway tracks to Montgomery Road, where it would break away and cut through Islington to Dundas Street. It would then run along the north side of Dundas to the Etobicoke Creek, where it would briefly break away to serve Somerville before rejoining and running on the south side of Dundas to Dixie Road. From there, it would once again parallel the CP rail tracks before turning north onto its own high-speed private right-of-way just west of Cawthra Road. It would then follow its meandering path through the countryside, passing through the villages of Georgetown and Acton before reaching the town of Guelph. Cars would then turn north onto Gordon Street and follow it and Wilson Street to McDonald Street. From there they would turn east and run to the line's final terminus at Wyndham Street. Unlike the City of Toronto, the town of Guelph was more than happy to let the TSR's Interurbans run a through service into its downtown. Additional stops for the line were located at Humber Junction, Montgomery Road, Islington, Stop 12, Eaton Farm, Somerville, Dixie, Cooksville, Center Road, Baseline, Streetsville, Meadowvale, Churchville, Town Line, Eldorado Park, Lower Hutt, Huttonville, Norval, Georgetown, Limehouse, Scotts, Dolly Varden, Acton, Blue Springs, Rockwood Road, Eden Mills, Aramosa, Speedwell, and Bay Street. It is also possible this route had flag stops given the gaps in the stop numbers. Service on the route between Guelph and Toronto operated twice daily. Additionally, there were 3 daily trips to Georgetown and 5 daily trips to Cooksville. The trips to Cooksville would be operated by 2 local cars and not the larger, more palatial interurban cars. The total travel time from Toronto to Guelph took approximately 2.5 hours. As part of the construction of the Guelph Interurban, the TSR would construct a new terminal and office building on Keele Street just north of Dundas. They would also construct a freight terminal and office at 2896 Dundas Street West. The TSR would purchase an express car to carry freight for the line. This car was 55 feet long and featured 2 large doors per side. They would purchase 2 additional cars in 1920. Freight service on the Guelph line was 30 cents per 100 pounds between Georgetown and Toronto. Freight service between Guelph and Toronto was 40 cents per 100 pounds. In 1918, the TSR would purchase 4 open platform cars from New York to be used as trailer cars to help deal with high ridership on the line. Finally, the TSR would construct a new carhouse and shops facility just north of Lambton Park to store and maintain the TSR's cars. After 5 long years of construction, the Guelph Interurban was finally open. However, issues would persist on the line for a time. For example, during the first month of its operations, there were a number of collisions at various street crossings. The Ontario Railway and Municipal Board would order the TSR to increase visibility of cars at certain crossings and even ordered that cars should come to a complete stop before crossing the road at other crossings. A complete reversal of how things usually work at a railway crossing. Mackenzie, for his part, still had even bigger plans for the Guelph Interurban, as he envisioned future extensions of the line to Kitchener and Stratford. This was supposed to be part of his broader strategy to make the Canadian Northern Railway more competitive with the Grand Trunk Railway in southwestern Ontario. This no longer mattered though, as by the time the Guelph Interurban opened in 1917, the Canadian Northern was bankrupt and was now effectively controlled by the federal government. On September 6, 1918, Sir William Mackenzie and his business partner Donald Mann would resign from their positions within the Canadian Northern Railway. The federal government was now in control of the Canadian Northern and with it the Toronto Suburban Railway. Operations on the TSR would continue unchanged until 1923. Firstly, on January 20th, the federal government would formally merge the Canadian Northern and Canadian Government Railways together to form the Canadian National Railway, or CN-Rail. As part of this merger, the Toronto Suburban Railway would itself be merged with Mackenzie's failed Toronto Eastern Railway, becoming the suburban division of Canadian National Electric Railways. The CNER would soon after enter into negotiations with the TTC and City of Toronto for the potential sale of their lines within Toronto's boundaries. After some prolonged negotiations, the TTC would formally purchase the Crescent, Davenport, and Lambton streetcars, as well as the Weston Interurban from the CNER. You can watch my videos on the Davenport and Rogers Road streetcars to find out what happened to these routes. This did come with the negative consequence that the CNER no longer had running rights into the City of Toronto. As a result, service on the Woodbridge Interurban would be cut back to the city limit at Northland Avenue. Due to this, the CNER would construct a new car shed for the Woodbridge cars just north of Wilson Avenue. The Guelph Interurban would be cut back to Lambton Park. The CNER also inherited the previously mentioned Toronto Eastern Railway as well as the Niagara, St. Catharines and Toronto Railway. These were two other interurban companies once owned by Sir William Mackenzie. Then President of CN Rail, Henry Thornton, had his own vision for an electric railway network across southern Ontario. He would start with first restarting construction on the Toronto Eastern Railway. To answer what the Toronto Eastern Railway was, we will have to briefly jump back in the timeline. The Toronto Eastern Railway was established on April 4, 1910 to construct a high-speed interurban from Toronto to Oshawa. A year later in 1911, it would be purchased by the Canadian Northern Railway, who increased the scope of the plan. Firstly, the line was to now be constructed out to Cobourg. Secondly, the TER had applied for additional right-of-ways. These included a line north from Cobourg or Port Hope to Peterborough, a line from Oshawa to Lindsay, a line from Scarborough to either Stouffville or Uxbridge, and a line from Oshawa to the lake. Construction on the main trunk line would commence in 1912 in Whitby. Construction would make it as far east as Bowmanville before it was halted in 1913. As previously stated in 1923, the CNER would begin reconstruction on this line. CN's president Henry Thornton's vision was for the Toronto Eastern Line to connect to the Guelph Interurban via CN's Belt Line, thus allowing for a through service from Guelph to Cobourg to be operated. He had also planned for a branch line to be constructed to a new terminal at Queen Street and the Don River. The old tracks between Whitby and Bowmanville would be rebuilt and the line was extended west to Pickering. A few test trains would be operated, but construction was halted once more in 1924. The province was not willing to provide additional funds to make it a fully operational railway. Part of the reason for this was due to political infighting. However, another reason was due to growing car ownership, with many of those cars being built in Oshawa. The province by this point viewed interurbans as an antiquated technology and had no interest in investing any more money into them. The CNER would abandon the project and instead focus their energies on the Guelph interurban. The tracks constructed for the Toronto Eastern would remain abandoned until World War II, when they were torn up to be used for their steel. The CNER would first lower fares on the Guelph line from 2 7/8 cents per mile to just 2 1/4 cents per mile. They would also introduce new commuter tickets to further lower the cost for those who frequently use the route. A person could, for example, buy a commuter ticket between Cooksville and Toronto for $5.85 and it would be valid for 50 rides. Secondly, the CNER would purchase 2 new cars for the line. These cars would be in the style of your standard electric railway car and not an interurban car. That is to say, instead of having a large central door, they had doors at each end. These doors were also designed for high-level boarding, and as such, conductors would need to place a stepping stool so passengers could get on and off the cars. With the additional cars, the CNER would increase service on the Guelph route. Service to Guelph itself would now be every 2 hours, while service to Georgetown would be every hour. The pre-existing cars on the route would receive an overhaul which included a new livery. The old dark green would be replaced by a bright golden yellow with blue stripes and golden lettering with a blue outline. Express cars, those that carry freight, would depart Toronto and Guelph at 6 a.m. each day. In 1925, the CNER would purchase El Dorado Park, which was a 128-acre recreation and amusement park. Electric Railway Journal would state that the park looked upon the choicest picnic property in the vicinity of Toronto. The park would prove a popular spot for Sunday school picnics and summer excursions and would generate a considerable amount of revenue over the next 5 years. In fact, during the really busy periods, the CNER would rent out additional passenger coaches to be operated as a full-blown train pulled by an electric locomotive. That same year, a new right-of-way into the junction would be constructed as the CNER no longer had running rights on Dundas Street. Instead, cars would now run on a right-of-way following the Hydro Corridor north of St. Clair Avenue. Cars would then turn south at Keele Street and run to a new terminal on the northeast corner of Keele and St. Clair. Service to this new terminal would begin in December of 1925, although it wasn't exactly luxurious as the passenger terminal was simply an old trolley car at the end of the track. It wouldn't be until 1929 that an actual small station building was constructed. In 1925, the Township of York and Village of Weston would purchase the section of the Woodbridge Interurban between Northland Avenue and Humber Street. The TTC would then double-track this line and extend the Weston streetcar back into the Village of Weston as part of the Township of York Railways on November 28th. This also meant that service on the Woodbridge Interurban was cut back to Humber Street. The CNER was now stuck with a 12-kilometer interurban that ran between Weston and Woodbridge and made no money at all. Local opposition would spring up to try and stop the route's abandonment, but the writing was on the wall. Before the line was shut down, protesters would call on the CNER to stop the abandonment, and G. Elmore Riemann would record an exchange that took place between a CNER official and a protester in his book History of Vaughan Township. How did you gentlemen get here? By automobile. That's why we're closing down the line. Service on the Woodbridge Interurban would officially end on May 10, 1926. Despite the service improvements, the abandonment of the Woodbridge Interurban, and the new electric park, the CNER's suburban division never turned a profit. This can be partially attributed to both the Grand Trunk Railway and the new Highway 7, which also served the same areas. Between 1926 and 1930, passenger numbers had dropped from 358,564 to 237,386. Revenues had fallen from $205,051 to $144,450 in the same time period. In fact, the CNER's suburban division had a net loss of $194,000 a year. That's $3,466,695 per year in 2025. Business historian John Dew would state, "The Toronto Suburban was by far the most unprofitable electric line in Canada in this period. Under private ownership, operations would have stopped by the mid-20s, but pressures on the government to keep the road going resulted in continued deficit operation when there was no chance of improvement." By the summer of 1930, car and bus usage had truly taken its toll on the Guelph line as people preferred to use the new Highway 7 between Toronto and Guelph. Traffic counts at the intersection of Highway 7 and Highway 10 showed 1,662 cars and 9 buses moving east-west through the area each day. Closer to Guelph, the count totaled 1,298 cars and 9 buses. By comparison, the Guelph Interurban was only carrying about 300 passengers per day. In 1930, the CNER would announce that it was no longer bound to continue paying interest on the old Toronto Suburban Railway bonds. On August 15, 1931, the CNER would default on its bond interest and the railway would go into receivership. John D. MacDonald would write of the last day of service in his book Halton Sketches, stating, "With little ceremony and much regret, the last train made its run from Guelph to Toronto on Saturday, August 15th. Car 106 gathered the lamps from the switches along the line, while Car 101 followed with the last load of passengers. Crowds gathered at each intersection and station to give farewell to the train, and even heads peered out of windows of homes along the line to get a last glance. Service on the Guelph Interurban had ended. The Toronto Suburban Railway was dead, ending 41 years of service. All of the old equipment would be stored at the Lambton Car House and would be abandoned until 1935. Or as James Salmon puts it, the line was left to rot. In 1935, the rails would be pulled up, the old buildings sold, and the cars were either sold to other operators or unceremoniously scrapped. While the Interurbans were gone, the TSR's local streetcar routes would stick around for a little longer in one form or another. By 1931, the Crescent and Lambton streetcars had seen their services ended. The Weston streetcar would stick around until 1947 when it was converted to trolleybus operations. Streetcar service along Davenport Road would end in 1966 with the abolishment of the Harburg streetcar. And finally, streetcar service along Dundas Street in the junction would end in 1968 when the Dundas streetcar was cut back to Dundas West Station. As for the areas served by the Interurbans, Guelph would still have its rail connection with the Grand Trunk Railway, which would in time morph into today's Kitchener GO line. Communities like Streetsville and Cooksville would eventually be connected by the Milton GO line. Woodbridge is ultimately the odd one out here, as it never got any form of higher order transit back after the Interurban was shut down in 1926. That can change though if the proposed Bolton GO line is ever built. So now the question is, what remains of the Toronto Suburban Railway? Well, there is a bit. Firstly, the most well-known part of the route that still exists is now the site of the Halton County Radial Railway Museum. Secondly, some walking trails follow the old interurban right-of-way. These include the James Street and Guelph Radial Line trails in Guelph and the Smith Property Loop Trail in Puzzlinch. Some of the old bridge supports that once carried the line over the Humber River are still in use today. For example, the Humber River Recreational Trail Bridge over the Humber River rests on the original pier foundations that once held up the Guelph Line's trestle bridge. Another example of this can be found at Albion Road's crossing of the Humber River. Here you can see the Sidewalks Bridge still uses the supports that once carried the Woodbridge Interurban across the river. Between Limehouse and Acton, you can still see a small part of the Guelph Line's rail bed next to the pre-existing railway tracks. As for buildings, you can still see an old substation building on Weston Road. Today it is an abandoned lumber store. You can also find another substation building on James Street East in Guelph. Today it is a private residence. Lastly, the old freight office along Dundas Street is now the Treasury Medical Center. Finally, Car 24 has been preserved and restored by the Edmonton Radial Railway Society and can be seen at its museum at Fort Edmonton Park. As for buildings that no longer exist, the original interurban terminal on Keele Street is now a shop. The original car shed at Old Weston Road is now a bingo parlor. The old Lambton car house is now a housing complex. The old Woodbridge line shed is now an empty field. The CNER terminal at St. Clair is also a housing complex. And lastly, the location of the Woodbridge terminus is now a salon. As for the Toronto Eastern Railway, you can still find small hints of it. In Oshawa, you can still see a small portion of its right-of-way just south of Bond Street, east of downtown. Another section of its right-of-way is now Keewatin Park. Lastly, a small section of the Curtis Millennium Trail follows the railway's right-of-way, and a pair of old bridge abutments can be found crossing the Farewell Creek. The Toronto Suburban Railway and its successors hold a unique place in Toronto's transit history. Its origins were found in a local streetcar network built to serve the village of West Toronto Junction. This network would grow out to eventually encompass multiple interurban lines radiating out to the north and west of the city. The Guelph Interurban was the most expensive and most complex interurban built in Toronto and was supposed to be the crown jewel of the Toronto Suburban network. Yet by the time it opened, the golden age of interurbans was already in its waning years. The Toronto Suburban would meet the same fate as nearly every other interurban operator in North America. The gradual expansion of car ownership and bus service slowly ate away at the Suburban's roots. This, coupled with a provincial government that had all but given up on passenger rail, spelt doom for the city's interurban lines. One of the great what-ifs in this saga is what if the CNER had been successful in constructing the Toronto Eastern Railway and linking it to the Toronto Suburban? How different would the Greater Toronto Area be if there was a high-speed interurban line running between Guelph and Cobourg cutting through the middle of Toronto? Would it still be around today? Would it be the region's only electrified GO line? Or would it have fallen apart in the post-war years due to car ownership? It's impossible to say, but it's hard not to realize the missed opportunity. And with that, I will end this video here. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the channel, and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about the Toronto Suburban Railway or the Toronto Eastern Railway, don't be afraid to do so in the comments section down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.